Hi everybody, Steven here. This is going to be my first video in a multi-part YouTube playlist covering, yes, VMware Cloud Foundation. That seems to be the big buzzword these days. So stick around and we'll talk about what it is. See you in a bit. Hi everybody, thanks for sticking around. So again, this is, like I said, this is going to be my first video of the YouTube playlist covering VMware Cloud Foundation. A lot of stuff that we're going to cover, so I'll be pushing out a lot of videos over time, right? This one right now, we're just going to talk about what VMware Cloud Foundation is. So just a strict lecture. I'll try to keep it quick and brief, right? Now, before we jump into it, I always like to throw this out there. If this is stuff that you kind of like, please support the channel by hitting that subscribe button. It's free. More subscribers, the better, right? Again, without subscribers, there's no content, really, right? Also, if another way to support the channel is super thanks. Totally up to you. Also, share the links with your buddies, your friends, family members, whatever, right? Let's jump into it. Let's get into my iPad. Okay, so let's jump into this. So what is VMware Cloud Foundation? So it says it provides a complete set of software-defined services for compute, storage, network, containers, and cloud management, right? Basically what this does is builds on VMware's three core components. And those three core components would be compute, storage, and networking. And under compute would be vSphere with your ESXi host, because that's our virtual machines. Under storage, it would be vSAN. And under networking would be NSX. Now, what this does is a couple of the main things that it does here. It does a fully automated deployment. So that's kind of the big thing. You actually download this appliance called the Cloud Builder, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And in this massive appliance, it has all this stuff, NSX, ESX, vCenter, and you basically fill out a spreadsheet with a bunch of the settings and you basically hit go, so to speak, and it automatically deploys your environment. There are some prereqs, which we'll talk about, but that's one of the big things. So what does that mean to me? That means I could go and install vSphere myself, set up my own vSphere environment, which you see me do videos on. I could also, at that point, set up my own vSAN cluster, no problems, and I can install NSX. I've got videos on all of those things. So what makes VMware Cloud Foundation different? Basically, it's, lack of a better term, it's a scripted install of all these. You basically fill out this parameter worksheet, you plug it in, you hit go, and it deploys everything for you. Like I said, there are some prereqs, which we'll talk about. The other big thing it does, though, is life cycle management, right? Upgrades and stuff like that. So it makes sure all these versions are all compatible with each other, right? So that's a really big thing. And then it also provides our path to the hybrid cloud, which again, can be physical on your on-prem or partially on cloud or whatever the case may be. So when I talk about VMware Cloud Foundation, you do see there's the vSphere component, right? Providing us with our compute. You see the vSAN, I'm just going to highlight the vSAN portion of it. You see the vSAN component, which again provides us with our storage. And then you see the NSX, which provides us with our networking and security. With VMware Cloud Foundation, or VCF, you could also deploy a Tanzu environment. Tanzu, if you're not familiar, it is basically a container environment using Kubernetes, using the vSphere's product. So basically, vSphere Tanzu is like vSphere Kubernetes, so to speak. We'll touch on that much later. ARIA, which was previously called vRealize, so a set of management tools. So it contains all this as well. So it contains all these features if I want to. When you do your first deployment, it actually will deploy your vSphere, your NSX, and I'll call it the vSAN. Okay. Notice it's talking about virtual volumes here. You know what? We'll talk about storage later on. Now, one thing I want to point out is right over here, this thing called the SDDC Manager. What the heck is that, right? We'll take a look at that later on, but this is actually your GUI on how you manage your VMware Cloud Foundation environment for the most part, okay? So we'll take a look at that. We'll see a lot of that over the upcoming videos as well, but we need to kind of get things started, right? Now, I've said before, this comes bundled with all this software, right? Well, which version? When you go to VMware Cloud Foundation, I think the latest one as a filming was, or recording, I should say, not filming, was 5.1.1, right? And in there, when you look at it, there's a thing called the bill of material. And the bill of materials will tell you the versions that are currently on the Cloud Builder image, which I'll talk about what Cloud Builder is. So when we look at this, and where do I get this? Let me go to my desktop. Let's go to here. Let's fire up my browser. And I'm just going to go to our good old place, docs.vmware.com. And I'm going to click on all products. I know they've been making changes there at Broadcom, or VMware by Broadcom. Let's let's go to C for cloud, and cloud director, VMware Cloud Foundation. I'll click on that. When I click on that, you'll see the Foundation 5.1. You'll see release notes. When I click on that, you'll see the 5.1.1 release notes. Okay. When I click on the release notes here, it'll come up. It gives you what's new. I'm not going to read through all that stuff, but right there is where you see your bill of materials. So it'll show you the version of Cloud Builder, the date, all kinds of stuff, and the build numbers. What's really, really important here on this list, all this stuff is cool. What's really important here is the ESXi version, 8.0 update 2B, build number this, okay? One of the things I mentioned, it deploys your environment for you, but there are some prereqs. One of those prereqs is you need to have 4 ESXi servers already up and running. Now, however you set those up, if you automate the install, that's great, or if you just do it manually, walk around with the USB stick, whatever, right? However you do it and you get it up and running, it has to be at this version, at this build level, or it will fail, okay? Because there's this thing that it does checks, which I'll show you in other videos, and if it doesn't find the proper build number, it just stops and says, sorry, we're not continue on, because this is what it's been certified with, okay? So that's kind of cool. So that's the bill of materials, right? And I'll talk about this this part here of building up your environment. All right, let's go back to my iPad. So that's the bill of materials, and you get that right from the release notes from the docs.vmware.com. So let's take a look at the architecture of Cloud Foundation. First thing is this concept called workload domains. You'll see down at the bottom here, I got this one called the management workload domain. Then I got this VI workload domain 1, VI workload domain 2, and VI workload domain whatever, X, right? VI is virtual infrastructure, which is kind of funny. That goes back to our version 3 days of like 2008, 2007. But anyways, doesn't matter. When we first go to deploy this is the first thing that you're going to set up, this management workload domain. And you'll see there, these are 4 servers, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you have to manually or automatically, I don't care how you do it, you have to install and set up 4 ESXi servers at that build level I was showing you. So if you're going to be deploying VCF 5.1.1, you need that ESXi build level, which I showed you in the video, okay? So those hosts have to be set up. They also have to have their DNS set up, forward and reverse lookups. They also must have proper time synchronization, okay? There are certain hardware compatibility that these servers have to have. Again, you have to look at that. Now, from a lab perspective, who cares, right? But in a production environment, they have to be vSAN ready nodes. Now, one of the things here, when we look at this management domain, let's just focus on that. Forget about all these other ones, right? When I look at the management workload domain, when you look inside it, what does this thing do? First of all, it will create a vSAN cluster. So notice my data store is vSAN. So these hosts have to have disks inside it. And again, the hardware compatibility goes through and says, this is what's compatible, okay? So you got to make sure of that. So it's going to create a vSAN cluster for you, a 4-node cluster. It will set up vCenter server. So you'll see you'll have a vCenter server there. It's going to install this thing called the SDDC Manager, which we'll talk about later. Just ignore that for now. And it's going to install 3 NSX Manager nodes. So remember I said it did the 3 core components? Compute, well, there it is, vCenter. Storage, well, there it is, vSAN. And last but not least, networking, there it is, NSX. And you see it deployed 1, 2, 3 of these appliances. It deployed a distributed switch for me, right? Now, optionally, and this is what you do afterwards, there's a thing called the bring up process. Once you start to set things up, you're doing a greenfield install, you're doing a brand new install. Once you start installing it, it does all this for you, right? Okay. Then the other stuff like ARIA, okay, that's optional. You deploy after the fact, and I'll do videos on that later. Okay. So we've got this management workload domain, which is comprised of minimum four servers. You can have 8 if you want to do a stretch or whatever, right? I'll talk about architectures later on, but let's first learn how to walk before we run. So you'll notice inside our management workload domain, you've got stuff like vCenter Server, NSX Manager and stuff, and ARIA. Now, let's say you now want to deploy another workload domain for stuff like maybe this is going to be for my, my SAP application, right? So I'm going to deploy this workload domain, so I would actually add 3 more servers and say I want to create a workload domain. And at that point, your workload domains generally will have your workloads running on it. So if you see in my little graphic here, I got workload domain 1 here, and it's got these VMs running on it. Maybe that's my SAP applications. Workload domain 2 here has a bunch of servers, and again, it's got a bunch of VMs running on whatever. Maybe that's my HR applications or workload, and then whatever my last workload domain here, I got a bunch of VMs running. Maybe there's containers or something like that there. So the idea behind this is let's have management separate from workloads. Okay, that's kind of the whole concept here. Now, how many VI workload domains can we have? And it mentions here, says max isolated workload domains is 24. Technically, the management is also a workload domain, so that would be 25. And what do I mean by isolated? Right now, when you deploy the first management workload domain, it's going to have a single sign-on domain. Okay? That's a vCenter term if you're not familiar with it. It's going to have a single sign-on domain that does authentication. If you want, these additional workload domains can all be part of that single sign-on domain. And if that's the case, then at that point you can have up to 14 more, so a total of 15 included in the management. That's called enhanced link mode, where I've got multiple vCenter servers and I'll manage them all from one umbrella. Okay. If I want to get beyond that, I can say no. Each workload domain is going to be its own single sign-on domain. Right? You can do something like that. And that's what they refer to as isolated. So you can get all the way up to, well, let's include the management one, 25. So 25 would be the management, and then you can do 24 more VI workload domains. Now, sorry, let me just make sure. Yeah. All right. So let's take a look at how this is deployed. So right now, when we look at this picture here, I'm just going to elaborate a little bit more. So here's my management workload domain, and we see all our management stuff over there. Notice it's a vSAN cluster. So the data store is vSAN. You don't have a choice. Has to be vSAN. So these 4 nodes have to be vSAN ready nodes. End of story. Okay? The workload domains, now if I decide I'm going to deploy some workload domains, again, I can have like 3 servers here or whatever. Notice the data store now says supported data store. It could be vSAN, NFS, fiber channel, whatever. As long as it's a supported data store, okay? You can do combination. I can have vSAN here as my primary, and then maybe do fiber channel as my secondary storage. I could do stuff like that, okay? But the main thing here is the management workload domain has to have a vSAN data store. End of story. The other ones, you have the option of picking and choosing what you want. Now, when you deploy another workload domain, so in this example, I got 2 workload domains here, and they've got their VMs or workloads running, whatever they are. Where are their vCenter servers? What it's going to do is spin up another vCenter server and another NSX Manager environment for each of these workload domains. So if you look at my picture here, I have let's clear this. I have my management workload domain, and there's its vCenter right there. It's the SDDC Manager, and then you see the NSX Manager over here. So it's got its 3-node cluster. That's 3, not 4. Then when I spun up my other workload domain, it's going to spin up, we'll call this orange, it spun up a vCenter server appliance on the management domain, and it spun up an NSX management cluster, 3 nodes again, on the management domain. So the management VMs stay on the management domain, and the workloads just have their workload VMs running, which kind of makes sense. And here I spun up another workload domain, called it the green one, let's say. It spun up a vCenter server for that workload domain and 3 NSX managers for that workload domain. So you can see right off the bat, if you've ever played with NSX, these NSX managers can get a little resource hungry. You can have a whole bunch of workload domains, and if each one has their own set of NSX managers, this management domain better be able to handle all those resource requests for memory and storage and CPU, okay? So that's something. Now, I want to mention this. When you spin up your first domain here, that's the management domain, it gets its set of NSX managers. Boom. That's for the management domain only. When you decide, oh, I'm going to spin up a workload domain, it's going to spin up, here's the orange one, it's going to spin up an NSX management cluster and a vCenter server, okay? Now, if you spun up a second workload domain, you can say, oh no, the second workload domain, don't spin up an NSX management cluster for that. Utilize the one from the first, from workload domain 1. So I can share the NSX manager with different workload domains, but I cannot share the one in the management domain. That's just for the management domain, okay? End of story, okay? So, so this is what we call a standard architecture. And a standard architecture basically means I have servers that are basically for my management domain, and then I have other ones for workload domains, just like I'm illustrating. But when you look at this, this can get pretty expensive, especially, if you're a small shop, let's say, right? Because at a minimum, I need 4 hosts for management, minimum 4, and then for me to spin up another workload domain, I need 3 more over here, let's say. Let's say I'm using vSAN. So let's forget about that. So at a minimum, I would need 7 servers to do something like this, okay? To get around that, VMware gives you an option. So this is called a standard architecture, and this is called a consolidated architecture. Notice in this one here, we have our management workload domain, our 4 servers, 1, 2, 3, 4 ESXi servers. You see our management resource pool here that has the vCenter server for management, has the SDDC Manager, which we'll talk about, and then it has the NSX management cluster. I'm not showing you ARIA, but again, optionally ARIA could be in here as well. It's got a distributed switch. What's different between this picture and these other ones I showed you is we're going to now have workloads running on our management domain. So technically I can do this with a minimum of 4 servers. So what this does, it's going to create a management resource pool, and that's where all the management stuff runs. Then it's going to create a resource pool for your compute VMs and whatnot. Okay, so you can do that. And if, let's say you want to start off at this and then maybe gradually go to a standard architecture, you can do that. Okay. So that's standard architecture, consolidated architecture. Now, how do we get this stuff up and running? So what you got to do is you got to log into your VMware account. If you don't got one, if you just want to set up a lab environment, you can go to, you could join up as the Advantage member for VMUG. I'm not getting endorsed or anything like from them. And you can actually, if you're an Advantage member, you can actually download VMware Cloud Foundation. So you download this thing called Cloud Builder. What is this Cloud Builder? So it is used to deploy and configure the first cluster. That's the management domain, okay? It's used to do that. It validates your information. So there's a thing called the parameter workbook, right? So it's a spreadsheet that you enter various information, DNS stuff, all that kind of wonderful stuff. And then you basically import it into the Cloud Builder appliance. And at that point, it will go through and it'll actually check and make sure everything's okay. Notice it says it can be run on a laptop running VMware Workstation or Fusion. I shouldn't say most of the times. There's been some problems reported back to VMware where the workstation that somebody may be using to deploy this may not be powerful enough because it's dumping a lot of stuff across the network, and eventually it times out. This thing takes about 4 hours to deploy everything, okay? So if you got a really, subpar laptop or workstation or whatever, and you're just trying to deploy this from that, it may time out and you may have problems. So one of the recommendations is if you've got a spare server, if you've already got a vSphere environment and you want to set up a VMware Cloud Foundation, just run it on a VM on one of those environments. That's your best bet. But if you're not, if you're just completely, you're doing a new deployment, maybe spin up a server, run it on top of that. So just be aware of that, okay? You can do that. I've done it from my laptop. My laptop's pretty powerful, so I didn't really have a problems, but I've heard some people having problems doing that, right? So this is a cloud builder. It is basically an appliance. It's a VM that you deploy. I'll do a video on that. It's got 4 virtual CPUs, 4 gigs of memory, and about 280 gigs of storage, right? That's a fair amount of storage. Why? Well, it's storing your ESXi images, your NSX images, SDC, the SDDC Manager image. It's storing the vRealize. All this stuff that's on that bill of materials is in there, right? Okay. And from a network, make sure you got a static address. Make sure you got fully qualified domain name for this appliance too. Call it whatever, cloudbuilder.acme.com, whatever in your environment. You need forward and reverse lookups. Verify connectivity is in place with the Cloud Builder appliance and a management VLAN in your environment. So this appliance needs to connect to the management interface of your ESXi host, which I'll actually show you. So here is a picture of how we deploy this. And I will demo all this stuff in future videos. But here's our management workload domain. So there's my 4 servers. I've set them up. I installed it. Maybe this is called ESXi1. That one's 2, 3, and 4. I got forward and reverse lookups. I have proper time synchronization. All those are important. If not, when you go through the Cloud Builder and it does a validation, it will fail and say, sorry, there's no DNS record. Sorry, there's no proper time synchronization. It will fail and you'll have to go and fix these. Another thing is certificates is also a big one, and I'll cover that in one of my videos. If you're going to use the self-signed certificates, that's okay. You have to, once you deploy your ESXi server, you need to regenerate the certificate to the new host name, okay? It's pretty simple. I'll show you that in the video as we're building mine. If you're using your own certificates as well, again, you can be aware of that. So certificates do matter. Where you could run into problems is if you're just using the default self-signed ones and you didn't regenerate it after you prepared your nodes, okay? Like I said, I'll cover that. So this cloud builder appliance will do this for you. It will create this management domain. It's called the bring up process. You basically fill out this spreadsheet with all the various parameters. I'll show you that, right? You then basically import that into the appliance. It's really simple. It's a little button. You say upload, boom, it brings it in. It goes through, checks out the spreadsheet, checks out your host, says, yep, everything looks good. And at that point, once everything's good and you hit next, it starts deploying the environment for you. And it sets this up. It'll install your vCenter server. It'll set up a 4-node vSAN cluster. It will install the SDDC Manager. It will install that 3-node NSX Manager. It will create a distributed switch, right? So it basically sets up everything for you. This doesn't happen in 10 minutes, okay? This takes about 3-4, depending on your environment, probably about 3-4 hours. And mine, it takes about 3 or 4 hours to deploy, okay? Now, notice I mentioned over here, there's this spreadsheet that you fill out. This is really easy to do, okay? And I'll show you that. But if you want to get more fancy, for whatever reason, you can actually export this Excel spreadsheet into a JSON file and edit it and get some more advanced features. What's an example of that? And I'll do a video on it, and it's actually not that difficult. Notice right now it's deploying 3 NSX managers. That's perfect. In production, that's what we want. But let's say you're at home in your lab environment and you go, man, I don't have enough resources to run all this because this is pretty intense. I could actually go in to a JSON file here and modify it so it only deploys a single NSX manager. And I'll cover that in a video, right? And so it can be imported from a spreadsheet or a JSON. The JSON gives you more configuration flexibility, but it's also prone for human error, people typing, making mistakes. The spreadsheet's really easy to do. And that's basically what Cloud Foundation really is, okay? And like I said, the big thing is understanding the architecture. You have that management domain. You could do a standard architecture or consolidated. Remember, standard, you deploy your management domain, workload domain, and then you deploy additional workload domains after that, okay? The consolidated is, I don't have enough servers. It will deploy the management domain for you, and then you put your workloads on top of that, right? So maybe you're in a small environment, this works perfectly fine. And again, you can migrate to this environment if you want. Maybe I'll do a video on that much later on down the road. That's basically it. I'll have other videos covering how to set this up. Last thing I do want to show you, and I'll cover this in quite a bit of detail later on in other videos once we learn how to do all this, is the thing called the SDDC Manager. Once your management domain is up, you go up, everything's up and running. I can now use this thing called the SDDC Manager, log into it. Remember, it's a VM. It's right there. Yeah, it's right there. All right. I can log into that, and then at that point, I can manage my VMware Cloud environment. I can deploy more workload domains. I can manage networking. I can deploy edges. We'll talk about all that. So there's a lot of stuff that you actually do from within the SDDC Manager. And I'll probably do a tips and trick videos as well, because once you start using the SDDC Manager, you really don't want to do things any other way. Like you want to manage networking, let's say, from the SDDC Manager as opposed to within NSX. So I'll cover that as we go through this series. But that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for sticking around. Hey, and again, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please support the channel by subscribing. I'm looking to hit that 10,000 mark. It'd be nice. But that's it. Leave your questions and comments below, and I'll have more videos on this coming up very quickly. See you in a bit.